The Dakota wind has a voice, if you know how to listen. It whispers tales of desperation, of courage born from chaos, and of love that ignites in the darkest of nights. This isn't a story you've heard in a dime novel. This is a story etched into the very rock of the Black Hills, a story of two souls from warring worlds, thrown together by a tempest of blood and betrayal. It's the story of Elara Vance, a woman with healing hands, and a past she couldn't outrun, and a Lakota warrior she found dying at her doorstep. She offered him a single night of sanctuary, a fleeting chance at life. But she never could have known that by the time the sun crested the mountains, that same man would stand as the new chief of his people, and his first command would be to declare her the white woman who saved him his wife. Forever. The world beyond Elara Vance's cabin was a canvas of churning grey and violent charcoal. The sky moments ago, a placid ocean of late afternoon blue, had been torn asunder. Rain didn't fall. It assaulted the earth in sheets driven by a wind that howled like a cornered wolf through the ponderosa pines. For most settlers in the Dakota Territory of 1878, a storm like this was a curse, a thing to be endured behind bolted doors. For Elara, it was a shield. Her small, sturdy cabin was nestled in a forgotten fold of the Black Hills, far from the nearest settlement of Deadwood, and even further from the prying eyes of the U.S. Army patrols. Here the mountains kept her secrets, and the wind sang a lullaby of solitude. At 24, she had the weathered hands of a woman twice her age, and the weary eyes of a soul who had seen too much. She'd come west not for gold, but for escape from a life in Philadelphia that was meant to be a gilded cage, a forced marriage to a man whose touch felt like ice. Her father, a physician named Dr. Alistair Vance, had taught her everything he knew of medicine and botany before he passed, and that knowledge was her only true inheritance. It was what kept her alive. The storm raged, and Elara methodically checked the seals on her windows, the scent of wet pine and damp earth filling her small home. As lightning split the sky, illuminating the thrashing trees in a brilliant, ghostly white, a sound cut through the gale. It wasn't the crack of a branch or the cry of an animal. It was a dull, heavy thud against her cabin's outer wall. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one ever came this way. Prospectors stuck to the Creek soldiers to the main trails. This was her sanctuary, and its sanctity had just been violated. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth, its weight a meager comfort, and pressed her ear to the thick timber of the door. Nothing but the roar of the storm. Hesitantly, she lifted the bar and cracked the door open with a sliver. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her grasp, and then she saw him. Sprawled in the mud and deluge at the foot of her porch steps was the body of a man. An Indian. He was face down, his long black hair matted with blood and rain. He wore buckskin leggings and was naked from the waist up, his bronze skin a road map of corded muscle now slick with water. A deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder down his back, oozing a dark crimson that the rain couldn't wash away fast enough. Another darker stain was spreading across his side, a bullet wound. Every instinct, every warning whispered by the fearful folks in Deadwood screamed at her to slam the door, bar it, and pray he was dead or would be soon. He was Lakota, part of the people the newspapers called hostile savage, the very warriors who had wiped out Custer's command only 2 years prior. To help him was treason. To be found with him was a death sentence. But then he groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony. It wasn't the sound of a savage or a demon. It was the sound of a man in his final desperate moments. Ilara looked at his hand, clenched in the mud. It was a strong hand, but it was trembling. She saw not a warrior, but a patient. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a mantra from her childhood. You don't treat the uniform, Ilara. You don't treat the skin, you treat the wound. Cursing herself, the storm, and the whole damnable territory, she dropped the poker. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw the door wide open, oblivious to the rain that soaked her in seconds. Gritting her teeth against the man's dead weight and the slick mud, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag the dying Lakota warrior out of the storm and into the fragile sanctuary of her home. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing their fates together within the four walls of the cabin, the world outside swallowed by the fury of the sky. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of burning herbs, blood, and rain-soaked earth. Ilara worked with a frantic, focused energy that pushed all fear to the back of her mind. She had dragged the warrior onto a thick bearskin rug near the hearth, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his powerful frame. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps her age, or a little older. His face, even contorted in pain, was sharply defined, a strong jaw, a high-bridged nose, and features that spoke of a proud lineage. He was lapsing in and out of consciousness, his dark eyes occasionally fluttering open, clouded with fever and confusion. He'd flinch when she came near, a deep instinctual mistrust, warring with his body's utter helplessness. Easy now, she murmured, her voice soft and even, knowing he couldn't understand the words, but hoping he would recognize the tone. I'm not going to hurt you. The gash on his back was deep, likely from a knife, and crudely stitched with what looked like sinew. The stitches had torn open, but the bullet wound in his side was the real killer. It was low near his hip, and the bleeding was sluggish but constant. It needed to come out. She stoked the fire, heating the tip of her sharpest knife until it glowed a dull red. The man's eyes snapped open, locking onto the blade. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He tried to push himself up, a monumental effort that ended in a sharp cry of pain as his muscles screamed in protest. Stay still, Ilara commanded, pushing him gently but firmly back down. She held up her hands, showing they were empty. The bullet. It has to come out. She pointed to the wound, then pantomimed, digging something out with her fingers. His eyes, intelligent and piercing, even through the haze of pain, seemed to understand. He watched her every movement, tracked with suspicion. He was a coiled viper, ready to strike, even as he lay dying. Ilara understood. In his world, a white woman with a knife could only mean one thing. She had to earn his trust, and she had to do it quickly. She set the knife aside to cool, and instead turned to her remedies. She ground yarrow into a paste to pack the wounds and stop the bleeding, its pungent, earthy smell filling the room. She brewed a potent willow bark tea for the pain and fever. When she brought the steaming cup to his lips, he turned his head away. His jaw clenched. Please, she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. This will help. She took a small sip herself, showing him it wasn't poison. His eyes remained fixed on hers, searching for what she didn't know. Deceit, malice. After a long, tense moment, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He allowed her to tilt his head and pour the bitter liquid slowly into his mouth. He coughed, but he drank it. It was a tiny victory, a fragile bridge built across an impossible chasm. As the tea began to work, its magic, his muscles relaxed slightly. He was still watching her, but the feral edge in his gaze had softened to a wary observation. Now was the time. She took a clean cloth, soaked it in whiskey, her father's last bottle, reserved for medicine, and cleaned the area around the bullet wound. He hissed, as the alcohol stung his body, going rigid, but he didn't fight her. Then came the knife. She showed it to him again, then her forceps. She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze one last time. "This is going to hurt," she said, knowing the words were for her own benefit. She cut. He let out a strangled cry, his entire body convulsing. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist in a grip of pure steel. His knuckles were white, the pressure immense, but it wasn't an attack. It was an anchor. He was holding on to her, focusing all his agony into that single point of contact as she probed the wound. Tears streamed from her own eyes from the sheer intensity of the moment. It felt like an eternity, her fingers working deftly in the bloody mess while his grip threatened to crush her bones. Finally, she felt the forceps grasp the jagged piece of lead. With a final sickening pull, she extracted the bullet, dropping it with a clatter into a metal basin. The man's grip on her wrist slackened. His head fell back against the fur, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He was drenched in sweat, pale beneath his bronze skin, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, and for the first time the suspicion was gone. In its place was something else, something deeper. Acknowledgement. Respect. He drifted into a fitful sleep. Throughout the night, Elara tended to him. She packed the wounds with the yarrow paste and bandaged them with clean linen torn from her own petticoats. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water. In his delirium he spoke in his own tongue. The words were guttural, rhythmic, flowing like a river. She didn't understand them, but she heard the names. One name was repeated, with a soft reverence, Black Bison. And another was spat with a venom that chilled her to the bone iron claw. As dawn approached, the storm broke. The warrior's fever had abated, and he was sleeping peacefully. Elara, exhausted, sat in her rocking chair, watching the first pale fingers of light pierce the darkness. She had saved him. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The bullet she'd pulled from his side was not an army issue. It was a crude, hand-cast lead ball, the kind used by settlers and other Indians. This wasn't a battle. This was an ambush, an assassination. And she had just harbored a man whose enemies, whoever they were likely still hunting for him. The warrior awoke with the sun. The pale morning light streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He didn't stir suddenly, but came to awareness with a quiet stillness, his eyes opening and immediately taking in his surroundings. They were clear now, the fever gone, replaced by a sharp, assessing intelligence. He saw Elara dozing in the chair, the exhaustion evident on her face. He saw the basin with the bloody water and the discarded bullet. He saw the careful, clean bandages on his body. He tried to sit up, and this time the pain was a clean, sharp fire instead of a debilitating agony. He grunted, and the sound woke Elara instantly. She was on her feet, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she used for her herbs. He held up a hand, a gesture of peace. His gaze was no longer hostile. It was inquisitive, heavy with unspoken questions. He looked at her then, around the cabin filled with drying herbs books on medicine and tools that were clearly not for farming or ranching. He looked at her hands, stained with herbs and his own blood. "Who?" "You," he asked, his voice a low, rough rasp. The English was heavily accented, broken but clear. Elara was taken aback. She hadn't expected him to speak her language at all. "My name is Elara Vance. I live here." He nodded, slowly, absorbing this. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "They call me Black Hawk," the name she'd heard in his fevered whispers. Black Buffalo Bull. No, wait. She'd gotten it wrong. He was saying Black Hawk, the other name, the one he said, with reverence, Sitting Bull, and the hated name, Iron Claw. Black Hawk. she repeated softly. You were hurt badly. There was a storm. He pushed himself to a sitting position, ignoring the fresh wave of pain. His eyes were fixed on the door, as if he expected enemies to burst through at any moment. They will look for me. Huelara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Soldier's Black Hawk shook his head, a grim set to his mouth. He looked around, his eyes landing on the cold hearth. He reached over, took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the firebox, and began to draw on the smooth, flat hearthstone. His hands, though weakened, were steady. He drew a circle of teepees, a camp. In the center, he drew a large teepee and a figure of a man with a feathered headdress. An old man. The Chief Ilara understood. He then drew two younger figures beside the chief. He pointed to one taller and more imposing. Ironclaw, he said, his voice laced with contempt. He pointed to the second figure. Me, Black Hawk. He made a motion to show they were of the same family cousins. His story unfolded in the stark black lines on the grey stone. He drew Ironclaw, speaking to the chief, his hands animated, angry. He drew Black Hawk, arguing, gesturing toward the east, toward the reservations, his expression pleading. He was arguing for a different path, a path of peace, or perhaps strategic survival, while Ironclaw was arguing for war. Then the drawings became more sinister. He drew Ironclaw meeting with a small group of warriors in secret away from the camp. He drew them riding out, and then a picture of himself alone, hunting. The next image was of arrows flying from the trees and a rifle firing. An ambush. He drew himself falling from his horse, then fighting back. He depicted a fierce struggle, a knife flashing the source of the gash on his back. He had escaped, but barely. The implication was horrifyingly clear. Ironclaw, his own cousin, had tried to kill him. Why, Ilara asked, her heart pounding. Black Hawk's dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw a profound sadness. He wants to be chief. My father, he is old. He listens to my counsel, not war. We cannot win another war. We must be smart. We must find a new way. Ironclaw says this is the way of the coward. He tells the young warriors that I am weak, that my heart is white. He gestured to her, not as an accusation, but as an explanation of the insult. He would lead our people to ruin, to glory, in a battle that would be our last. The betrayal was deeper than a simple grab for power. It was a battle for the very soul of his people. Black Hawk was a visionary, and Ironclaw was a zealot. To seize control, Ironclaw needed to remove the one voice of reason that stood in his way. He hadn't just tried to murder his cousin, he had framed it to look like Black Hawk had fled a coward, abandoning his tribe. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She was now part of this. She hadn't just saved a random warrior. She had saved the one man who stood between his people and annihilation, and in doing so, she had made an enemy of the man who wanted him dead. Her isolated cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. Black Hawk seemed to read the fear in her eyes. He wiped the ash from the stone, erasing the story, as if to erase the danger it brought to her. I must leave, he said, attempting to stand. He will not stop looking. He swayed on his feet, his face pale. His wounds, freshly stitched and bandaged, were not meant for travel. He would bleed out before he made it a mile. No, Ilara said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. She stood and put a hand on his arm. His skin was warm, his muscles hard as oak, even in his weakened state. You'll die out there. You need to heal. You need to regain your strength. He looked at her, then at the rifle she kept mounted above the fireplace, her father's old Springfield. He knew she was right, but the urgency of his situation was a poison in his veins. Every moment he spent here, Ironclaw was cementing his power, spreading his lies. One day Alara pleaded. Just one more day. Let the fever pass completely. Let the wounds begin to seal. Please. Black Hawk looked out the window at the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Black Hills. He was trapped between the danger of staying and the certainty of death if he left. He looked back at this strange white woman, this healer who had saved him without question, who now offered him shelter at an unimaginable risk to herself. He saw no fear in her eyes now, only a stubborn, defiant resolve. Slowly he lowered himself back onto the bearskin rug. He gave a single solemn nod. One day. The day passed in a strained, watchful silence. Alara made a thin broth which Black Hawk ate gratefully. She changed his dressings, noting with professional satisfaction that the wounds were clean and the worst of the swelling had begun to subside. They spoke little. Words felt inadequate, dangerous even. Instead, a different kind of communication grew between them, a language of shared glances, of quiet understanding. He watched her grind herbs, his eyes, following the practiced, efficient movements of her hands. She watched him as he sat cross-legged, his back straight, despite his injuries, his gaze fixed on some distant point, beyond the cabin walls, his mind clearly back with his people. He was a man carrying the weight of a nation on his shoulders. She was a woman who had fled from the world, only to have the world's most dangerous conflict land on her doorstep. In their shared isolation, a strange and fragile respect was being forged. He saw in her not the weak, grasping woman of his cousin's insults, but a spirit as resilient and wild as the mountains themselves. She saw in him not a savage, but a thoughtful, burdened leader, betrayed by his own blood. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, a new sound reached them. It started as a faint, rhythmic vibration felt more than heard, then grew steadily louder. Hoofbeats, a single rider coming fast. Black Hawk was instantly alert. He moved with a speed that belied his injuries, grabbing the iron poker Alara had left by the hearth. His body coiled, every muscle tensed for a final desperate fight. Alara's blood ran cold. She snatched her father's Springfield from the wall mounts, her hands trembling as she checked the load. They stood back to back, a bizarre and desperate alliance, their eyes locked on the door. The rider did not slow thundering closer until he reined his horse to a skidding halt just outside the cabin. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the panting of the horse and the frantic beating of Alara's heart. Then a voice called out, not in English, but in the flowing Lakota tongue. Black Hawk visibly relaxed his shoulders, slumping in relief. He grunted a short, sharp reply. A friend, he said to Alara, his voice low. He is loyal. Alara cautiously moved to the window, peering out. The man outside was immense, a bear of a man with a stern, craggy face and a long scar that cut across his left eye. He sat atop a powerful war pony, his expression grim. He slid from the horse and approached the door. Black Hawk opened it. The two men spoke in rapid, urgent tones. Alara could not understand the words, but she understood the tone of catastrophe. The big man's voice was filled with grief and fury. He gestured wildly back in the direction he had come, his face a mask of anguish. As he spoke, Black Hawk's face seemed to turn to stone. The hope that had flickered in his eyes that morning was extinguished, replaced by a cold, devastating emptiness. The poker fell from his hand, clattering against the floorboards. He staggered back a step, leaning against the wall for support. His eyes squeezed shut, as if to block out the world. The big warrior finished speaking, his chest heaving. He looked at Alara with a mixture of suspicion and confusion, then looked back to his leader, waiting. "What is it?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. What's happened? Black Hawk opened his eyes. They were hollow, filled with a pain far deeper than any physical wound she could treat. My father, he said, his voice cracking. The great chief. He is dead. The words hung in the small cabin, heavy and suffocating. The big warrior, whom Black Hawk introduced as Stone Fist, explained the rest. After Black Hawk had disappeared, Iron Claw had returned to the village, claiming he had been ambushed by his cousin and a group of white men. He'd proclaimed that Black Hawk had made a deal with the army, selling out his own people for his life. The story was a lie, but a potent one. Then last night, under the cover of the same storm that had brought Black Hawk to Ilara's door, Iron Claw had made his move. He and his loyalists had gone to the chief's lodge. There were no witnesses to what happened inside, but when it was over, the old chief was dead. Iron Claw claimed the old man's heart had given out from the grief of his son's betrayal. A lie. Black Hawk spat his voice, trembling with rage. He murdered him. He suffocated him in his sleep. By sunrise, Iron Claw had declared himself the new chief by right of strength and blood. He had promised the warriors a return to the old ways, a glorious war against the whites, a war to reclaim their lands. His first decree as chief was to declare Black Hawk an outlaw, a traitor to be killed on sight. Stone Fist and a few others who knew Iron Claw's true character had fled, searching desperately for their rightful leader. The trap was complete. Black Hawk was no longer just an exile. He was a condemned man hunted by his own people. His father was dead, his name was Poison, and a murderer sat in the seat of power, about to lead his nation into a suicidal war. The world had collapsed around him in the space of 2 days. He had nowhere left to run. The air in the cabin crackled with despair. Stone Fist stood like a granite statue by the door, his gaze fixed on Black Hawk, awaiting an order that seemed impossible to give. Black Hawk himself looked utterly defeated, the lifeblood of his spirit draining away with every ragged breath. He was a chief with no tribe, a son with no father, a man with no future. Ilara watched him, her heart aching. The quiet, powerful man who had drawn his life story in ash was now being consumed by it. She saw him not as a warrior, but as a man pushed to the very brink of his soul's endurance. The healer in her, the part of her that mended torn flesh and broken bones, felt an overwhelming urge to mend this too. But this was a wound no poultice could touch. She moved silently, purposefully. She went to her stores and began to gather things, her actions methodical and calm in the swirling vortex of masculine grief and rage. She took a small leather pouch and filled it with dried yarrow for bleeding willow bark, for pain, and a precious handful of ginseng root for strength and stamina. This wasn't just medicine. It was a prayer, a hope she was packing into the soft deer hide. Black Hawk watched her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing, white woman?" he asked, his voice flat and empty. "You're leaving," she said, not looking up from her task. "You have to go back." Stone Fist let out a short, harsh laugh. "Go back. He will be torn to pieces before he can speak a word." Iron Claw holds the warriors in his hand. They are drunk on his promises of blood. "Then he cannot meet them with blood," Ilara countered, finally looking at Black Hawk, her gaze intense and unwavering. "You said it yourself. You cannot win another war. If you challenge him as a warrior, you are playing his game. You will lose. Your people will lose." "She is right," Black Hawk said softly, his eyes clearing with a flicker of his former strength. He looked at Stone Fist. "Iron Claw expects me to come for vengeance. He wants me to challenge him to a duel. He is stronger, and I am wounded. He would kill me, and it would look like justice. A new plan, desperate and impossibly slim, was beginning to form in his mind. He would not go back as a vengeful son. He would go back as a chief. He would not challenge Iron Claw's strength, but his wisdom. He would not fight for himself, but for his people. It was a terrible gamble. He would be walking into the heart of the enemy's power, relying only on the truth and the loyalty of a handful of elders who might still listen to reason. His decision was made. He pushed himself off the wall, standing tall. The emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a smouldering fire. He looked at Elara at the pouch in her hands. "I owe you a life," he said, his voice resonating with a new gravity. "I will not forget this." "Survive first," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward and pressed the pouch of herbs into his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt, as potent as any lightning from the storm, passed between them. It was a moment of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of the past 24 hours. She then did something that surprised them both. She reached up and unclasped a small, simple pendant from her neck. It was a piece of smooth, grey river stone, polished by the water that her father had given her years ago. It was her only connection to her past, to the life before she had become this solitary mountain woman. "For luck," she whispered, pressing it into his other hand. "So the mountains remember you." Black Hawk looked down at the smooth stone in his palm, then back at her. Her face was pale in the fading light, her eyes wide and luminous. He saw her courage, her compassion, her spirit. She was an anchor in the storm that was his life. In that instant, he understood something fundamental. He was fighting for his people, yes, but he was also fighting for the possibility of a world where someone like her could exist, where her brand of strength, the strength to heal, not to kill, had a place. He closed his hand around the stone and the pouch. He gave her a long, deep look, a look that held promises and questions for which there was no time. "Stone fist," he commanded, his voice now ringing with authority. "We ride." He turned and strode out the door without a backward glance, the big warrior following him. Elara rushed to the doorway, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched as Black Hawk, with Stone Fist's help, mounted his horse, his movement stiff with pain but resolute. He sat tall in the saddle, a wounded prince riding to reclaim his throne or to meet his executioner. Just before they spurred their horses into the twilight, Black Hawk turned and looked back at her one last time. His face was a mask of determination, but his eyes held the memory of their shared silence, of her gentle hands, of the impossible night that had bound them together. Then he was gone, swallowed by the encroaching darkness, the sound of their hoofbeats, a fading drumbeat of doom or perhaps of destiny. Elara stood alone in the doorway, clutching the empty space on her neck, a silent prayer on her lips. The Lakota camp was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. It was nestled in a wide, grassy valley, bisected by a clear, rushing creek. But the idyllic setting belied the tension that hung in the air, thick and suffocating as smoke. Warriors, their faces painted, for war stalked through the camp, their eyes wild with a feverish excitement, stoked by Iron Claw's promises. The women watched with anxious faces, and the elders sat before the council, fire their expressions grim and deeply troubled. Iron Claw stood in the center of it all, a colossus of muscle and ambition. He wore the ceremonial war bonnet of the chief, though it seemed to sit uneasily on his head, an honor stolen rather than earned. He was recounting for the third time his fabricated tale of Black Hawk's treachery, his voice booming across the camp. He fled like a coyote in the night. Iron Claw roared, gesturing with a massive fist. He conspires with the white soldiers to put us in chains on their reservations. His heart is soft. His spirit is weak. Iron Claw will lead you to glory. We will wash the Black Hills in the blood of our enemies and reclaim what is ours." A roar of approval went up from the younger warriors. They raised their rifles and lances, chanting his name. Iron Claw, Iron Claw. It was into this maelstrom that Black Hawk and Stone Fist rode. They didn't charge in. They walked their horses slowly, deliberately, from the edge of the valley. The chanting died down, replaced by stunned, confused silence. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as they recognized the approaching figures. Black Hawk, alive. Iron Claw's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. This was not part of his plan. He had sent 6 of his most trusted men to finish the job. Black Hawk should be a corpse rotting in a ravine. Traitor Iron Claw bellowed, pointing a trembling finger. "You dare show your face here, seize him, kill the betrayer." A dozen warriors loyal to Iron Claw surged forward, weapons raised. But Stone Fist let out a roar of his own and leveled his lance, his face a thunderous warning. More importantly, several older respected warriors moved to block their path, their expressions uncertain. They would not kill the son of their beloved late chief without a true reckoning. Black Hawk slid from his horse, landing unsteadily. He was pale, and his side was bleeding afresh through his buckskin leggings, but he stood straight, his chin high. He ignored Iron Claw completely. His gaze was fixed on the 3 elderly men sitting by the council fire, the keepers of the tribe's laws and wisdom. "I have come to speak to the elders." Black Hawk announced his voice, not loud, but clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "I have come to speak the truth." He walked forward, the crowd parting before him. He stopped before the elders and looked each one in the eye. These were men who had known him since he was a boy, who had served his father faithfully. "Iron Claw says I am a traitor." Black Hawk began his voice, ringing with a sorrowful power. "He says I fled from a battle he invented. He wears the chief's bonnet, claiming my father's spirit left him from a broken heart." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I ask you, elders, my father was the strongest heart among us. He faced down the blue coats, the winter, the starvation. Would his heart fail from a son's imagined betrayal, or would it only be stopped by a coward's hand in the dead of night?" A murmur of doubt swept through the assembled tribe. Iron Claw's story had always seemed too convenient. "Where are the 6 warriors who rode with you?" my cousin Black Hawk called out, finally turning to face Iron Claw. "The ones you said witnessed my treason, I see you returned alone." "Did they also suffer from broken hearts?" Iron Claw's eyes darted nervously. His men had not returned because he had ordered them to scatter and hide until Black Hawk was confirmed dead. Their absence was now a glaring hole in his story. "They are scouting for the enemy you have brought upon us," he blustered. "The only enemy I see is the one who would lead his people into a needless grave." Black Hawk countered his voice, rising. He took a step forward, pulling at the torn buckskin on his shoulder to reveal the crudely stitched gash beneath. This was not made by a soldier's saber. This was a Lakota knife. "In my back." He then lifted his shirt to show the fresh, clean bandage Elara had applied. And this bullet was not fired from a soldier's Springfield. It was cast from a hunter's rifle, fired from ambush, while I was alone. He didn't need to say who did it. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable. The warriors looked from Black Hawk's wounds to Iron Claw's face, who was now sweating, his bravado beginning to crack. "He lies," Iron Claw shouted, his voice shrill with desperation. He was saved by a white witch in the mountains. She has poisoned his mind. He is no longer Lakota, It was a desperate final gamble meant to paint Black Hawk as an outcast, forever tainted by the white world. But it backfired. "He is right," Black Hawk said, calmly stunning everyone into silence. I was dying. A white woman, a healer, found me. She did not see a Lakota or a white man. She saw a man who was wounded, and she healed him. She showed compassion that our cousin has forgotten. He turned back to the elders, his voice dropping to a low, intense plea. "This is the new strength we must learn. The strength to tell friend from foe, not by the color of their skin, but by the truth in their heart. Iron Claw offers you a glorious death. I offer you a difficult life. I offer you a future for your children. That is the path my father chose. That is the path I will follow." He stood before them, wounded, vulnerable, yet radiating an undeniable authority. He had not offered them blood and glory, but wisdom and survival. The oldest of the elders, a man named Grey Owl, rose slowly to his feet. His ancient eyes, which had seen a century of change, studied Black Hawk, then Iron Claw. He looked at the faces of the people, saw the doubt, the fear, and the glimmer of hope. The spirit of the Chief Grey Owl said, his voice raspy, but firm, is not in the bonnet. It is in the man. One man speaks of his own glory. The other speaks of the people's future. We have heard the truth. He turned to Iron Claw, and his final judgment was delivered with the force of a hammer blow. "You are not our chief." The elder's words fell like stones into a silent pool, the ripples spreading through the entire tribe. Iron Claw stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief, turning to raw, cornered animal fury. The war bonnet on his head now looked like a stolen crown on a court jester. The warriors who had so eagerly chanted his name now looked away, their gazes shifting to Black Hawk, their new true north. The challenge was over. No blood had been shed in the camp circle yet. A war for the nation's soul had been fought and won. Black Hawk had done what he'd set out to do. He had won not with his fist, but with his heart, with the truth his father had taught him. As if on cue, the first rays of the new day broke over the eastern peaks of the Black Hills. The light, pure and golden, spilled into the valley, chasing away the long shadows of the night and the darkness of Iron Claw's deceit. The sunrise seemed to anoint Black Hawk its light, catching the exhaustion and pain on his face, but also illuminating the unshakable resolve in his eyes. Grey Owl stepped forward, took the war bonnet from Iron Claw's head, and with solemn reverence placed it upon Black Hawk. The sun rises on a new day, and on a new chief. Lead us, Black Hawk. Lead your people. A cheer went up, this one genuine and heartfelt, a sound of relief and renewed hope. Black Hawk stood for a moment, letting the weight of the bonnet, the weight of his new responsibility settle upon him. He was their leader now. His life was no longer his own. Every decision, every action would shape the destiny of the hundreds of souls looking up at him. His eyes scanned the crowd, the hopeful faces of the women, the trusting eyes of the children, the renewed respect of the warriors. He knew his first act as chief had to be one of profound significance. It had to cement the new path he had spoken of. It had to be an act that would shatter the old ways of thinking and signal the beginning of their new journey toward survival. He raised a hand, calling for silence. The crowd quieted, waiting for his first command. "My people," his voice rang out stronger, now filled with the authority of his station. "We have chosen a new path today, a path of wisdom over pride, a path of life over a glorious death. This path will be hard. It will require a new kind of strength, a new kind of courage. He paused, his gaze sweeping over them all, before turning to look back toward the rugged hills from which he had just come. His thoughts were in a small, isolated cabin, with a woman whose courage and compassion had been the spark that reignited his own hope. To lead you down this path, a chief needs a wife, he declared, his voice resonating with purpose. A woman whose spirit is as strong as his own. A woman who understands that a healing hand is mightier than a clenched fist. A murmur of anticipation went through the crowd. The unmarried women of the tribe looked on their hearts, fluttering. An alliance with a powerful family would be a wise political move. But Black Hawk had no intention of making a political move. He intended to make a statement of the soul. "My wife will not be a daughter of our tribe," he announced, the words dropping like thunder, causing a collective gasp to sweep the valley. He pointed a steady, unwavering finger toward the mountains in the west. "My wife will be the woman with the spirit of the mountain, the white healer who saved my life when my own blood left me for dead, the woman who showed me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Her heart is not white or Lakota. It is true, the shock was absolute. To take a wife from outside the tribe was rare. To take a white wife was unheard of, a taboo, a sacrilege in the eyes of many. It was a move so radical, so audacious, that no one dared speak." Black Hawk turned to the stunned, massive form of Stone Fist. "Take my finest horse," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Ride back to her cabin. Bring Alara Vance to me. Tell her that the man whose life she saved now offers her his own. Tell her that the chief of this people asks her to be his wife, to be the mother of a new future. Do not force her, but tell her that I will wait." He finished his declaration as the sun fully crested the mountains, bathing the entire valley in the brilliant light of a new day. He had reclaimed his birthright, honored his father, and saved his people from a ruinous war. And with his very first act as chief, he had bound his destiny, and the destiny of his entire nation, to the solitary white woman in a lonely cabin, the healer who had saved him, who now held his future, and the future of his people in her hands. The declaration had been made, his wife forever. Now all he could do was wait for her answer. Once the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the vast silence of the hills, an unnerving quiet descended upon Ilara's cabin. The life and death urgency that had propelled her for the past day and night evaporated, leaving a hollow, buzzing void in its place. The air, still thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp aroma of healing herbs, felt heavy, stagnant. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Ilara moved like a phantom through her small home, her hands automatically tidying what was already neat. She scrubbed the hearthstone, erasing the last grey traces of Black Hawk's story, but she could not erase it from her mind. She washed the bloody rags, her knuckles raw from the lye soap, trying to cleanse herself of the choice she had made. Had she saved a man's life, or had she merely postponed his death while signing her own warrant? The sun began its slow descent, and with it, Ilara's anxiety grew. Her sanctuary had been breached. The knowledge of her existence was now carried by at least 2 Lakota men. If they were caught, they could be forced to reveal her location. If Iron Claw had spies, they could already be watching. The solitude that had once been her shield now felt like a trap, and the silence of the mountains was no longer a comfort, but a breath held in anticipation of a scream. Just as the sky began to bleed into the deep purples of twilight, the sound returned. Hoofbeats, a single rider. Steady, unhurried, but coming directly for her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lunged for the spring field, its familiar weight and cold comfort in her trembling hands. She peered through a crack in the shutters, her breath catching in her throat. It was the big warrior Stone Fist. He rode not the tired pony from before, but a magnificent black mare with a proud head and a saddle adorned with intricate beadwork. He led a second horse, a sturdy-looking chestnut with a simple, well-worn saddle clearly meant for a rider unaccustomed to riding bareback. He stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, dismounted, and stood beside the horses, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light. He did not approach the door. He simply waited, a silent, imposing messenger. Ilara's mind raced. Why was he back? Was Black Hawk dead? Had he been sent to silence the only witness to his leader's weakness? She held the rifle tighter, the barrel aimed at the door. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, knowing she couldn't hide forever, she took a deep breath, lifted the bar and opened the door just enough to see him clearly. Stone Fist met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He took a slow step forward, his hands held open to show he meant no harm. "The woman who heals," he said, his voice a low rumble. His English was broken, learned in fragments. "He is alive." Relief washed over Ilara so powerfully her knees felt weak. Black Hawk. The big man nodded, a flicker of something like awe in his scarred eye. "Chief, Black Hawk is Chief now." Ilara stared, uncomprehending. "Chief? How was that possible? He had been a fugitive, wounded, and hunted only hours ago." It made no sense. Stone Fist seemed to understand her confusion, but had no more words to explain the impossible events of the day. He simply delivered his message, the purpose of his journey. "He sends for you." He gestured to the waiting chestnut horse. He says, "You come. Be his wife." The word hung in the air between them, utterly alien and absurd. Wife. It was a preposterous joke, a mistake of language, but there was no hint of humor on Stone Fist's stoic face. He was delivering a command, a proposal, and a summons from his chief. Ilara felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. Her world, which had already tilted on its axis, was now spinning out of control. Wife to a Lakota chief. It was a fantasy from a madman's dream. She, Ilara Vance, who had fled Philadelphia to escape a respectable, loveless marriage, was now being offered a union that defied all logic, all law, all reason. Her first instinct was to refuse to slam the door and barricade herself inside. But then she looked around her small cabin. It was no longer a home. It was a hiding place, and its location was known. What would her life be now? Forever looking over her shoulder, waiting for soldiers to drag her away, for aiding a hostile, or for Iron Claw's men to exact their revenge. She thought of Black Hawk. She thought of the look in his eyes when she'd given him her father's pendant, a look of profound, silent understanding. He wasn't just offering her protection. He was offering her a place, a future, a life entwined with the destiny she had helped him reclaim. It was a terrifying, insane prospect, but it was also the only path forward that wasn't a dead end. Slowly she lowered the rifle. She looked past Stone Fist at the waiting horse and the vast unknown world that lay beyond. She was leaving one life behind. With a steady hand, she closed and barred the door to her cabin one last time, entombing her past within it. She then turned and walked out into the twilight toward the waiting messenger, ready to begin the impossible journey to her new life. And so, the declaration hung in the crisp morning air, an impossible promise that would change everything. The story of Chief Black Hawk and Ilara Vance was not one that ended at sunrise. It was one that truly began. Theirs would be a life of constant trial, bridging two worlds that were determined to destroy one another. She would face the suspicion of his people, and he would face the hatred of hers. Yet together, they would forge a new legacy, one of strength, through unity of survival, through understanding, and of a love that was brave enough to heal the deepest of wounds. This tale from the untamed heart of the American West is a powerful reminder that our greatest heroes are often the unlikely ones, and the most enduring bonds are those forged in the fires of adversity. If their story has captured your imagination, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a true story of the wild frontier. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more lost tales of courage, survival, and forbidden love to share with you. Thank you for listening.